it's flashing red or green. You want to flash it green?
Wow. Whenever you get, whenever I'm ready to speak.
I think we're ready to start, folks. If I have all of yours attention. We're very fortunate today. We've got Peter Muhoro from Pedernales Electrical Co-op. I've known Peter, I think, ever since you got here, right? I think we met shortly after you got into town. Peter is kind of bird of a feather to me. He has a PhD in physics, applied physics, so he and I can actually talk to one another, have a conversation, and almost understand what each other are talking about.
More like I'm a recovering physicist, but you know.
You got Maxwell's equations at your fingertips, right? Peter works for Pedernales. He's their director, strategic director for technology, basically. He's the guy who's trying to look into the future and figure out how Pedernales is going to change in the future as technology rises to more distributed technology, more distributed generation, and how Pedernales, with their somewhat bifurcated service area, is going to adapt in the future to serve not only its rural areas, but its more densely populated areas in West Austin. Peter got his PhD at University of Michigan. So you went from just about as far north as you can get in the United States to just about as far south as you can get?
Somehow find myself doing that.
And you've been here for what, 3 years now?
Yeah, almost.
Boy, it's gone quick. He's going to talk to us tonight a little bit about what's happening with Pedernales Electrical Cooperative, how co-ops are different in some cases than munis and regulated utilities such as Austin Energy or LCRA or some of the other entities we have in the state of Texas, what the challenges are going forward and how technology plays into that. We really appreciate your time tonight, Peter. And as in the past, we will follow up with beer and pizza over at Varsity, so if any of the students want to join us afterwards, Peter's agreed to come over and extend the conversation afterwards. With that, Peter, it's all yours.
Thank you, Fred. So secretly, I only came because I heard there's beer and pizza. So I said, what way? So I could go to a free happy hour? I said, sure. Peter Muhoro, Pedernales Electric Cooperative. Glad to be here today. I hope the echo doesn't bother people too much, but we'll fix it. So before we get started, just kind of want to gauge my audience and who I have in the room. Engineering, business school, policy, LBJ, physics. More than just one. Great. Anything else I'm missing? All right. So now I guess I know who I'm talking to. So what I'm going to talk about today is really just a conversation that I hope we can engage each other in. Talk about the utility, electric co-op model. By show of hands, who knows anything about an electric co-op? Okay. If you don't know, you'll learn everything you need to know today, with the exception of I had a cool video, but it doesn't play. So hopefully you can pass these slides over to folks if they need them. So with that, I'm going to start with a little trick question. And the question is, how can a person go 8 days without sleep? Any takers? I know someone's good. If not, I'm going to pick on you, Fred. So
Keep the lights on.
Keep the lights on. Anyone else? It's supposed to be a university, right? This is where thinkers gather and figure it out. Come on. I sit in meetings all day. I don't get the time to actually think until after 5 p.m., hopefully over a glass of wine, whiskey, or beer. But so, okay, come on. Someone give me something else.
By drinking a lot of coffee?
Drinking a lot of coffee? Great. Anyone else? Thank you. I'm glad that some people are thinking. We just had some storms the other day, so it was bad. All right, it's very simple. Sleeping 8 nights. I did ask days, right? Yeah, it's a little bit corny because I can never use a physicist, engineer, and someone walk into a bar. I've never been able to pull those out, but it's also not a tricky question. The reason why I ask this is because we're talking utilities, we're talking energy, and we're talking a way we've thought about for almost a century, and now in a time and a day when we're having to think differently on how we approach things. But the question is, has anything changed? Is the big question I like to ask folks. So What I want to talk today is pretty much a three-pronged discussion here. We'll talk about business models, we'll talk about structured markets, and we'll talk about infrastructure and what that cycle looks like together and how that comes all together. So I'm hoping that through this conversation we can actually enjoy picking each other's brains. I will say this, I'm looking for answers just as much as everyone in this room is looking for answers, so hopefully we can have this as a conversation. So not going to spend too much time on talking about the grid today, but it's very simple. Generate, transmit, distribute, consume. That's as simple as it goes, and that's the way we've done it for the last century or so. And the electric grid, the U.S. electric grid, one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century. So the question is, how does this all look like together? And you know, when you think of how the U.S. is really connected, three interconnections. You've got the Western Interconnect, the Eastern Interconnect, and ERCOT. If Texas was its own country, you know, I got a joke about that. I'm not a Texan. I am slowly becoming a Texan. I do not own any boots yet, and I still will not say y'all, so fighting that as much as I can. So that's what the structure looks like. And then when we go on, and we look at markets. And the reason why I'm giving a little bit of this is because the complexity in the electric grid is a lot more complex, and I hate to use that word again, than we think of it today. And so you've got several markets that cover the nation. Some of them have seen some restructuring, ERCOT and PJM. Some of them have very interesting ways of doing things. Some of them are going through some interesting things, such as New York, and looking at and even California. And so very interesting ways of how the U.S. operates in terms of markets. Now, when it comes down to it, there's a question of rate making. And the easiest way has been the traditional rate of return mechanism when you look at how can I be the most stable way in making sure I get my rate of return. Now, regulators use many other ways of coming up with rate cases, and not going to get into really going through each one of this as much as just showing you some of the ones, and we're getting more and more complex when it comes to rate making. And I'll get into it a little bit as we talk of the different utilities and how they all come together. So there's always the question of what is your cost of service, and the utilities have to ask that question over and over again. Now, I did some physicists, so somewhere I feel the need to put an equation. It wasn't the sexiest one, but I felt like as though I just have to, right? And so very simple equation. You look at your operating expense plus the capital minus depreciation multiplied by the rate of return. And that is what defines your cost of service. Typically, utilities are doing that on a regular basis. We tend to refresh ours every 2 to 3 years. With the changing dynamics of things, it could be that we have to do it on an annual basis. So a lot of challenges on how you evaluate how your revenue and what you need to conduct business. Now, I will get into the different utility types, and that will show you why the differences exist in some of this, looking at how this goes. So when we look at how does this get functionalized, I could say in a way, if you just think of generation, transmission, distribution, consumption. That's really the functionalization of the grid and how you go about it. It includes different things as you look at energy and capacity, what you need versus and the cost of delivery, all the way to the metering and the billing side of it and the dynamics of that. That is an interesting side of it. Now, I like to think of this as where does my dollar I pay the electric bill go to? And it's very simple, and I like to bring this up because as you look at utilities, sometimes people say, why can't my utility do X, Y, and Z? In essence, the way to look at it is about 54% of it is looking at the power side of it. It's generation. And then you look at about 10% transmission and about 36% distribution. So in our case as a distribution utility, we tend not to have too much control of 64%. We only can control 36% of what our revenues look like. And so it's a very important thing to think about as we think of new utility business models, because this is a difficult model when in many cases you don't have the capability to control some areas. So with that, I'm done. Everything has changed and nothing has changed. I heard someone say this quote years back, and I thought to myself, that makes sense. And then I thought about this industry, and I look at the folks who've been in this industry longer than I've been alive, and I look at those who are coming into the industry, and there's been changes over and over again. But the core thing is, in fact, I'm going to ask, what is the thing that has not changed? I'm sorry, what was metering? Capital intensive. Anyone else? Thank you. You know, sometimes I wish my phone would ring and someone says, I came home, I turned on the electricity, and the lights came on. Thank you. We do not get those calls. We get the calls, why is my bill so high? And when are you going to turn the lights on? And I could use a few other words in there. That's the way the business is. So the keeping the lights on is the one thing that has not changed and will not change. We will continue to expect to come in and the lights are on and that there's air conditioning. I happened to be in Europe last week and got into Houston, and all of a sudden my glasses just fogged up and I forgot what humidity was like. And I'm like, I need air conditioning. I'm like, first world problems, but still, you know. So with that, I like this picture Mackenzie did in terms of disruptive technologies, and we hear a lot on what's disrupting every day. You look at renewable energy, it's really disrupting the traditional utility business model on how we did things. You look at advanced materials, 3D printing, energy storage. All these things continue to become things that actually disrupt our business model and how we do business. But I've got a more important question. What's even more disruptive than those technologies? The phone, okay. I know we all got, if not one, at least two or three or four. I carry two with me all the time, and I usually have an iPad. Not sure why, but anyone else? I think what's more disruptive is a consumer. The consumer actually is the one who's become more disruptive in the utility business model than anything else, because the consumer is now empowered with being more and more active in the way they consume, the way they understand. I could look at my phone and I could see, you know, consumption at any given time. I really don't spend time doing that. I have other things to do. I have a life, but I know people who do that. And so all of a sudden, a consumer today has become a very different consumer than the consumer who was just happy they could iron their clothes using an electric iron. That consumer has completely changed than the one today where I don't even need cable because I have Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, name it, I've got it all, and some more. So the way I consume things has completely changed. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about utilities. Three kinds of utilities: investor-owned utilities, munis, and co-ops. And I will spend the rest of my discussion mostly on co-ops. Most of my background has been in electric co-ops. But essentially, when you look at electric utilities, you've got the Dukes, the PG&E, all the big ones out there, SCE, mostly serve urban areas, pretty big. You've got the munis, Austin Energy being one of them, owned by the city, governed by the city council kind of thing. And then you've got electric co-ops, which are owned by the customers and governed by a board of directors. It's typically the case. Munis are regulated according to each state's regulatory framework. Munis, quite similarly, but regulated by the local elected officials. We are not PUC, the Public Utility Commission, regulated. We do try to follow the PUC guidelines, but we do not need the PUC to change our rates. Purely dependent on the board of directors. And the history of electric co-ops, I'll get into it a little bit, but this became more and more common because this would not serve the rural areas back in in the 20s and 30s. And so as you look at the way this divides up, you've got about 60% of those are publicly owned utilities, mostly munis. About, just believe it or not, IOUs only about 6%. And then you've got co-ops, which take about 26, 27%. And then federal agencies and power marketers as well have a split in this. So that's the distribution of what utilities look like. And I hear, in many cases, you'll hear people reference utilities and think of investor-owned and forget there are about 3,000 other utilities out there that provide power as well. So, yes. So, for example, electric co-ops only generate about 5% and deliver about 11%. I don't remember the muni number. I have it somewhere. I just don't recall what it is. Exactly, yeah. So more of the generation and delivery is actually on the IOU side of it, the higher percentage. So let's just localize it here a little bit more. Texas, a little bit different kind of beast. 12% of consumption in the U.S. is Texas, and I think the number was, if we were a country, would be about the 7th largest consumer, if I recall correctly, something like that. So demand continues to increase here. We've seen our transmission costs go up by almost 90% in the last 5 years. So large changes, especially with the CREZ lines that were built and how that has impacted the cost of transmission. The ERCOT market, folks familiar with this market? I thought I knew markets until I came here, and then I got into ERCOT and I got very confused, and I'm glad I never did this as a study because it's a very interesting market. But essentially, if you look at power prices, power was really cheap in ERCOT. We averaged $24 a megawatt hour in 2016, 2.4 cents a kilowatt hour. Very cheap average prices. That cap, it's allowed those pricing for scarcity reasons can go up to $9,000 at any given time. We have not seen those kind of prices in a while. I think, and Fred, you might be able to help me out here, 2011 was probably when they hit 4,000. Oh, yeah, the cap was, I think, 4,500 or something like that. So that's the year there was 100 days over 100 plus degrees every day. So we've not seen those prices, but there's always the threat that that could happen. And the other piece of this market that's interesting is that the cost of transmission is defined by the average of 4 15-minute intervals, your highest peak in June, July, August, and September. And that defines what we pay for transmission for the following week, for the following year. And so a lot of very interesting dynamics. In fact, I like to joke that if we can figure out the peak and at that point we just shut down everything, it'd be great. We wouldn't have to pay for transmission. So, but of course we couldn't do that. So, so that's just a background on the market. So now let's get deeper into electric co-ops and just talk a little bit more about what electric co-ops are. And I had a cool video. It's not going to play, but that could always be passed around. So that was going to be the video. So really the electric co-ops, the history of electric co-ops were founded in the 30s when investor-owned utilities would not invest in the rural areas because they did not see the rate of return as quick as they wanted to see it. And so really, and the way this came about was to really on a mission of just saying, how do we power communities to empower the people and to change their ways of life? So it's the way, how do you bring in infrastructure, how do you bring in business models and the way of living to collectively bring this together. So just in terms of background, about 865 distribution co-ops in the U.S. and about 60 or so, 65 generation and transmission co-ops. Serve about 42 million, cover 75% of the landmass. That's the reason why you can see most of the green has a co-op at least. And when you look at distribution lines, 42% of the distribution lines in the U.S. is on co-op space. So a lot of long territory, and I think I quoted the numbers on generation and delivery. And so remember, these are not-for-profit, customer-owned, customer-controlled. So the 501c12s, which mandates that 85% of your revenue has to come from service that you provide directly to, without necessarily making a margin off of it. So, and I'm not a tax person, so don't quote me exactly on that, but it's not hard to find it. But that's really the bottom line of electric co-ops. So the way we do business, our goal is not necessarily to make a lot of money to give shareholders, because our shareholders are those that we provide power to. They're the owners of the co-op. Who knew REI is a co-op? Land of Lakes is a co-op. And then there's the co-op beer place. I can never remember the name of it. Blackstock? There you go. So there are a lot of co-ops out there. I mean, but people tend not to remember that electric co-ops function just the same way as all these other co-ops. The one that really surprised me, Ace Hardware is another co-op. But Land of Lakes, the butter people, I just never thought that that was a co-op. So just in terms of a time frame, if historical reasons and you're interested in history, this is what the growth of rural electrification looked like back in the 1930s. So we were founded in 1938 with the help of then the Congressman Lyndon Johnson. In fact, if you were in our headquarters, right across the street is his childhood home. So if you ever feel like driving out to Johnson City, it's an interesting place. Co-ops function under the 7 cooperative principles, not necessarily mandated by this, but these are just 7 principles that they operate by. And they tend to be a very good way, especially when you look at the concern for the community and how we engage the community in what we do. So how do we compare with other utilities? As I mentioned earlier on, IOUs serve more urban areas. So when you look at number of consumers, IOUs are typically at about almost over 500,000 on average. Munis take about 22,000, about 10,000, and electric co-ops about 22,000. So I'll get into, remember that number because it's going to get a little bit interesting just here, that about 20,000 or so is the average electric co-op. Consumers per mile, this is a very interesting one. Investor-owned utilities, about 35 consumers per mile. Munis tend to be very small in denser areas, so closer to 50, and then electric co-ops only about 7 consumers per mile. So what that means is we serve places that are very, very rural, where you could go a mile with just one customer. Revenue per mile, investor-owned tend to be right about the 80,000 per mile. Muni is a little bit more because of the smaller areas that they serve. And then electric co-ops actually collect the least amount for the area that's covered. So a little bit about who we are. If you do not know who we are, just go west of Austin and we begin to be the power provider, about an 8,100 square mile territory, all the way out to Junction. You may ask why there's, I think that's the laser pointer, maybe not. But anyway, there's a difference between our territory is not contiguous. There's another co-op in between. When we look at our western territory, we serve about 2 accounts to a mile, and our eastern territory about 21 accounts to a mile. Just some statistics where currently, if I recall correctly, these are numbers as of December 31, 2016, but at this point, I think we're already at about 292,000 active accounts. We grew about 12,000 new accounts in 2016. And let's take it back to where I said the average co-op is about 20,000. So a lot of growth here in Texas, and we're adding an average co-op about every 18 months is what we see in our territory. So I've been here for almost 3 years. I could confidently say we've added 2 co-ops within our territory, essentially. And, you know, this getting down with 723 employees with about a $6 billion revenue. How does power look for us? Now, this is a critical one. I said we're purely a distribution co-op. Now, this will get interesting a little bit later as we get into the discussion of business models, because we don't generate. Now, when I say that, we've got small solar, you know, in a megawatt here, megawatt there that we do, but we're not generating what we peak at 1,500 megawatts, which is what our load seems to look like. So LCRA, the Lower Colorado River Authority, is who we've have a contract with. We've had a contract with them. In fact, we're involved with them for really a long time in the founding of PEC and LCRA. Our contract goes out to 2041. It was signed before most of us in management got here, and hopefully I'll be retired by then and somewhere playing golf or something. But our contract requires us to buy 65% of our load. That's a minimum requirement, has to come from LCRA. Right now, we've probably at about 83% of our load. And the reason why it's interesting dynamics, it's LCRA is a cost-plus organization. So if we pull out our load, they have to adjust their rates based on all the customers now. And so the question is, the trick on balancing this is, if we pull out our load from LCRA, is us maybe going on the market or signing a wind contract, is that low enough in that dollar per megawatt hour compared to when they adjust their rates, the impact that it has for us pulling out? So this is where the interesting challenges come in how you run your utility. We unfortunately don't have a choice because we have a contract. And so right now we've executed about 17% of it out on the market. We're always evaluating what we could do with it. So I want to set the stage for the fact that not only is there the generation, the vertically integrated utilities, the generation side of it, but the distribution utilities also do stand some difficulties because of the fact that contracts exist so that the financiers can finance the generators as well and see where the guarantee comes from for them to get paid. So very interesting ways to go about this. So my question I want to pose, and we were having an interesting conversation on what the future looks like, and I will selfishly say the co-op model is the way of the future. I will selfishly say that because I want to have a job for a really long time. So, but let's get into it, and maybe we'll see why that is the case. So how do co-ops, you remember I said we're not for profit, consumer-owned, consumer-controlled. So at the end of the day, my goal should be to collect the least amount of money to provide the best service that I can to my customers. So in fact, my goal should be to reduce my revenues as much as I can, but keep my margins healthy so that the banks can see that we're doing well. Very different way of looking at business, because every business is saying, how do we increase our revenues? And in fact, since my boss got here in 2013, since that point till the end of last year, we actually reduced revenues quite a bit, but increased our margins. Very different kind of way of thinking on your business model, because, and we'll get a little bit into this, because a question on revenues, ask yourself, do you even care as a distribution co-op where your electrons come from? You're a poles and wires company, right? And so if this is the model, if this is how you should operate your business, then who cares how it looks like or where the electrons are coming from, as long as I can run the grid in a healthy way and provide the best service at the lowest cost. And that lowest cost is because I don't have shareholders to please. I could do this at the lowest cost. So keep this in mind. We'll get into it a little bit later. Just how did we get there? If anyone is curious, we've had a bunch of rate reductions. I do not hear utilities that do rate reductions. I've been at this for a while. You're not hearing much of that. But it is through many different things we've been able to do some things that have impacted how we do business. So what changing factors do we see coming up, and why are we challenged in this utility business model? When you look at different technologies, so you look at distributed PV, you look at utility scale PV, you can see the trend over the years of what's been happening in terms of cost. So this alone will allow, for example, when someone puts in LEDs and the cost of LEDs goes down, that means if you generated all this power in the hope of lighting up all these buildings, but now they consume a lot less, it changes the way you do business. So how you stack up on thinking of revenue is very, very interesting to make sure that you're lining up with what's happening. And as you can see, this is just a period of about 8 years. And we know that this trend is continuing as we see different technologies. Batteries are really looking very attractive. Solar, we were talking about just a little bit earlier how it's becoming very cost effective. This has led into what, and I'm not a big fan of calling it the smart grid because that implies there's a dumb grid. So I like to say smarter grid. That has led into the situation where the traditional generate, transmit, distribute, consume looks a little bit differently. Looks generate, don't distribute necessarily, transmit. So it looks very different in the game, and how you control it all is what are the challenges utilities continue to face every day. A lot of utilities have legacy systems, so it's a big challenge for them to figure out how to take that and move into this kind of dynamic environment. So we've done a few things to move towards that, the effectiveness as a utility, especially a poles and wires company. And I like to give the example of fueling. The way the utilities did business is, the guys, first thing they do is, or even at the end of the shift, they go fuel their truck, park it so they're ready for the next day. Well, what we did is now we actually have fuel brought into the warehouses and into the districts, especially with 8,100 square miles, and we actually fuel them. So the guys come in, they finish their shift and park the truck, and they come in the next morning and it's fueled. Efficiencies and how you go about doing this as a utility is very critical, and the fact that there are technologies now that allow you to figure out how to do some of this, including things like we're able to track if there's an outage somewhere, we could see who's the closest person and dispatch them right to it. It sounds very just the way you should have been doing business, but believe it or not, there's many utilities who are not even there yet. So a lot of efficiencies that have to come with this. So I'm going to ask a question. I've asked this before. If you've heard me ask this, try not to answer it. But is solar cost effective? Who thinks that today solar makes sense and it's cost effective? Okay, who doesn't think it is? Who doesn't know? Who doesn't care? Okay, at least you all care. So I asked this question. It's interesting because if you walk into a room with solar developers, they will all raise their hand right away. If you walk into a room with utilities, they'll say, heck no, it is not effective. We cannot do it. Then you have the rest of the folks who are unsure of where it is. But so we took an exercise to run this on just one of our commercial accounts. And the reason why we ran this, they're interested in solar. They wanted to know what their rates will look like. The beauty of a co-op is we have relationships with those that we provide power to. And so we ran the numbers to see, is solar cost effective if they were to put it on there? And then we factored in our, what their rates look like and, their demand charges and everything. And I will tell you this, I'm not going to go into the assumptions as much. You can always see them later. But from day one, you can see the orange line is with solar, the blue line is without solar. From day one, their cost is less. So now you have to ask yourself as a utility, what are you doing to ensure that, because if they put this on by themselves, they've done it. Are we relevant anymore? Do they need us anymore? That's the question you have to ask yourself as a utility. And you have to face this reality every day. And so how can you, or what can you do to get involved with this kind of thing? That's where we keep talking about the business models and how this changes. I'm proud to say co-ops are leading in doing solar in the U.S., maybe not in terms of actual generation, but in terms of just propagation throughout the U.S. You can see this map, and I think this is probably by mid-2016, and it continues to grow. I worked at the Trade Association for Electric Co-ops, so very familiar with the co-op space. DOE just published the success of co-ops doing solar, and a lot of it too is the ease of rate making exists in the boardroom and not having to go to the PUC and many other factors. Storage, does it make any sense? We're looking at some of these technologies to say, can we figure out how to integrate it? We've got a few projects, and I just like to throw this out there, that there are many applications you could use storage for from the generation side of it to the transmission and distribution side of it, all the way to the end use side of it, and which way you play with it and what chemistry you use and all of that really is critical in how we do business. So we're actually working on a few projects. I'll just show this one here that we received some funding from the state, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, to look into a battery. So we're hoping to kick this off here in just signed the contract, so we should be getting this kicked off here in a few weeks. But we'll be able to demonstrate how you could do this economically and what business model the utility can take to actually make this happen. So I'm going to get a little bit into the thinking differently on business models, and I don't know how much I'm doing on time. Maybe, okay, perfect. I'll run through this really quick. So one of the things we looked at is all these things can happen, but financing is always the barrier that people face. And so we've evaluated how can we, I said, we're a poles and wires company. Do we really care where electrons come from? Not necessarily. So if we could actually facilitate, for example, someone putting up solar on their roof, then we actually should not care. And so, but we realized some of the barriers is financing, and so we developed a program. So I remember I told you guys we could reduce our revenue, increase margins. We created a program called Empower Loans, and the whole idea of this program is you get a loan. It's on the face of your bill. We have access to cheap money, so we only mark up about 1%. And the key thing to this was you kind of ask yourself as a utility, why would you give money to take away sales from you? Because by me saying, please put solar, it means I'm not delivering as many kilowatt hours. But because of our business model, it allows us to look at this and say, well, I don't care about revenues, I care about margins. So I could calculate how much I lose in terms of margin contribution and then look at how much I gain based on loaning money. And actually it turned out to be that it was twice the amount from the loan than it was from what we lost in terms of kilowatt hours. We're not bankers. I'm not getting into the banking business, but it makes sense for us. And we could do this for a utility, for a co-op model. So I'll run through these ones a little bit. Consumer engagement is critical. You've got to provide different rates. Energy services, we provide a bunch of different ways, energy audits to engage our consumers. It's key to continue to engage the consumers on what we do. We offer a solar tour once a year in the fall. You guys are welcome to come whenever. It's early October. And kind of wrapping it up, and then we're going to get into some Q&A. So the big question is a consumer-centric utility. The funny part is co-ops have been consumer-centric for the last 8 decades, but now this is the big buzzword in the industry, right? And so who should really operate the grid? And, PwC did a very interesting paper on looking at the different blueprints of the future. I'd recommend you guys read it. It looks at how does this market look very differently. And, this is, I think, the key thing to look at is we've got the traditional way of doing business, which is the more integrated and very asset-based, the big power plants, and got a lot going on. But as we look at what the utility business models begin to look like, what does this look like in the future? Who operates this? And you could see each one of them has the business focus and how does it profit. And you have to ask yourself, does this line up with what your focus is? And if you're going to say you're a consumer-centric utility, what focus do you really have, and what challenges, and how do you split it up? So, but the big challenge with all of this, regardless, as much as we want to evaluate different things, we already have predefined markets today. And that is one of the difficult parts. If you recall back, I showed the interconnects and then the different markets and the different independent service operators throughout the U.S., the RTOs and the ISOs. How do we begin to have that conversation? So what does the future look like? EPRI's done a very good paper called The Integrated Grid that talks about what does the future of the grid look like. Historically today, you say affordable, reliable, safe, and environmentally conscious, but really flexible, resilient, and connected is what the future has pushed us to become, because we're not in the generate, transmit, distribute, consume model and that linear path anymore. So, and then you look at what does pricing look like, and this is just out of the National Academies of Science, and I'm pretty sure Fred, the Energy Institute, has some predictions as well. But when I start to look at these numbers, I can already see solar PV, for example, and conventional coal, solar just making a lot more sense than coal. So now what has been my traditional way of doing business compared to what new technologies look like is very different. So how does this impact what we do? I thought I would throw this in here. If you've not had a chance to read on the 51st state, the whole idea of the initiative, I was involved at the very beginning of it, was what if you had a blank slate? How would you define the market today? And how would you, what are the things that you need to do incrementally, and what are the things that completely have to shift? And as you can see, the big thing is, how do you engage the consumer? Because the consumer has continued to change. If you recall, I said the most disruptive thing is actually the consumer, and not as much as the technology. So I'll give two different models that are out there. We're not going to spend too much time, so we allow some Q&A, but two models out there. One that is being tested somewhat now is the distribution system platform provider. So New York is looking at this, and how do you coordinate consumers in engaging the consumer and the resources that they have, and also how do you bring in third-party providers and engage it all in one market that which doesn't exist in our typical way of our ISOs and RTOs today. So that's one platform, at least it's being tried. Another platform is a whole distributed system operator model, which is being in discussion. I know Minnesota is talking about looking at this, and I happened to be at the NERUC meeting by mistake. I had a breakfast with someone who dragged me into a conversation. I can only deal with so much on regulators. Hopefully there's no regulator in the room, but this is a discussion that's becoming more and more common, and the whole question is, how do you get down to things such as blockchain when you look at energy and transactive energy? How does it really begin to play out? So these are models that utilities are continuing to look at. I think it's going to be more and more challenging, because at the end of the day, if you continue to own these large assets that have provided baseload generation for a long time, there's a certain point where that may not be the needed thing anymore. There's a certain point where, with the trajectory of things that we see going, where solar and storage, for example, will begin to be that makes sense, rather than having, and so how do you think of what that future looks like? How do we transition into that kind of future? And so, I showed this earlier on how things grew, but I like to ask the question of, what does the growth look like when we say electric co-ops in the future? Does that curve look like that? Does it look a little bit different? I still claim that as a not-for-profit, consumer-owned, consumer-controlled distribution poles and wires company, I think that's what the future of the utility looks like. Because your skin in the game is to ensure people still get the service that they need, but you don't necessarily, the question of where the electrons come from, that will be transacted very differently in the future. So I think I'm going to leave it with that, Fred, and open up for Q&A. And of course, I've got my contact info for anyone who has it.
Thanks for your talk, Mr. Muhoro. So you said that PEC has a contract signed with LCRA until 2041. Post 2041, how do you see PEC procuring their power given the number of IPPs in the state?
Oh, great question. And that's a tough one to say. What I will say is, as we move into an environment of higher penetration, some of what we actually are encouraging, it will allow us to see more flexibility. So let's take the scenario where our minimum requirement is 65% of our load. let's take the scenario that we have penetration at 35% at 2041. So now we enter an environment of saying, we've already capped what we could pull out of LCRA. How do we negotiate beyond that? I think the strategy that would go beyond that is looking more and more closer to what, for example, Georgetown has done and evaluating what the options are out there. What can I buy that's, say, load following that helps me meet certain things? I still have to consider factors such as the 4CP, the 4 coincident peak, and how that could rise, and the scarcity in pricing. But I do think it's going to be a very tough discussion to enter into another long-term contract at that point, if that's the case. Now, I will give an example of, and I will not mention the state, but I know a state and a bunch of electric co-ops who went on and about a year ago signed another, I think, 50 or 75-year contract. I would not have done that if it was me doing it, because it's too uncertain to know what that looks like. And so I do also think that the changes will actually come with the next generation of leaders. So the students in this room will be the ones making the decisions at PEC, or, at the tail end of making the decisions. And that's where the key thing of the fundamental way of thinking, the challenges we face today, is legacy systems and a business model that has afforded us such a very comfortable way of life every day, to where now we're being disrupted a little bit, and I've got to change differently, even though I've done things as I've always done them every day. And change is not good. I don't like change. So I think a combination of those things will define how power is contracted at that point.
I'm curious how you think consumers are going to pay for electricity in the coming years. So we have solar maybe eating into volumetric energy rates. We have maybe storage in the future eating into demand charges. What does the future look like from the rate-making perspective for you?
Great question. I wish I had the answer for that, because I would be a very rich person today. It's a question a lot of people are trying to figure out, because those are the challenges. So let me even make it a little bit interesting. Say I have a time of use rate option, but I also have solar and storage at my house. Do I receive the credit based on the time of use consumption or not? Because, for example, if I was getting paid to discharge my battery at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I should be getting paid at the really nice rate that power is looking like at the, based on time of use. That's the thinking. That's not necessarily how it always goes. So you can see where the challenges exist, because there's going to be a lot of, I do think we'll see more rates that are demand charge focused. I know California keeps moving closer and closer to that, so I think that's a future of where we head towards. I do think there will be scenarios of a fixed charge and that's it. I think where we need to, how we've allocated fixed charges versus variable charges is going to have to change. Right now, the way it's set up, it only allows for rate making in a certain way, and that is what the complexity is. I do believe, and I don't think we're too far from transactive energy being what the future looks like. The only challenge with that is, how do we integrate the systems and the markets to ensure that that is the case? But I think that more and more consumers, I would be fine knowing what the market prices look like and knowing how I consume, and I think that's the future of the consumer. So it's a very complex question. If I had those answers, I would probably be in a corner office somewhere making a lot of money.
I've got one. So seems like Pedernales Electric Co-op has got a customer base that lets you have some flexibility and do some experimenting to kind of drive things forward. How do you maintain that? Was one, experiments don't always go that well, and you can spend money and have it not work out for you. Have you seen that with other co-ops? Is it hard for co-ops to recover from that, or do they have a customer base that stops allowing that kind of experimentation? Have you seen that?
I will say it's also difficult for us. It's not the easiest. It's not like I wake up and I've got the next greatest idea and I want to do it. Because at the end of the day, I have to ask myself, what is the impact as I look at my dollar per meter? So I always have to ask that, because that's my shareholder who I'm affecting at any given time. We have a little bit, because of being large and being the largest electric co-op in the U.S., we've got a little bit more flexibility to bring in some capabilities to look into doing certain things. So, for example, the calculation on looking at our financing, we did not have to go outside to consult on that. So we can already avoid the cost of doing it out there because we've got the in-house expertise who are doing several other things, but they could dedicate some time. That's the ease of what we're able to do. Other co-ops rely a lot, and even munis rely a lot on their trade associations and the EPRIs out there. I worked at NRECA, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, on the research arm of things, and we provided these solutions so that the co-op did not have to go work on it. And so, and that continues to happen. And so that's, in many cases, a 20,000 member co-op has to rely on that to be able to try some of this and then watch what other people are doing. So a lot of it also relies on some of us who are larger to kind of, you know, trailblaze and open up some ways for other co-ops to be able to follow.
So I'm interested to know more about how co-ops might grow in the future. Do you see today the growth in your territory from new construction? Is it a combination of new construction and expanding your service territory? And then to kind of dovetail with Ben's question, one idea I had is because you've got like an order of magnitude difference in consumers per mile in different territories, do you ever explore the idea that you might price differently depending on how sparsely populated it is?
Great question. I'll tackle the last part and then come back into the earlier part of it. So the history of our territory is our Western Territory was a co-op on its own. It used to be Kimball County Electric Co-op and merged with Pedernales, I think, in the 80s. I'm not sure what exactly it was. As a standalone, that co-op would most likely have to have higher rates just to maintain as they are. In fact, I think we ran some numbers that if we did not do anything on that side of that co-op, stopped upgrading, and just allocated the funds that are used to maintain that area and the loan assets and everything for that, it would take years, decades to ever pay itself off with no maintenance. So we've considered the idea of can we have different rate structures that operate in that perspective. It's a little bit hard because as a member-owned cooperative, democracy is a big thing. So, and providing equal services to everyone. So you have to play around with that game. Where we see some interesting challenges, I'll give you an example of one area we're looking at is we've got a member who's at the very end of a feeder, and the voltage, as you can see, when you've got 1 or 2 meters to a mile, by the time the voltage at the very end, it's low and not as stable as you'd like it to be. And so the solution in many cases is to upgrade from a single phase to a 3-phase, and that will fix it. But that is a lot of money to do it for one customer. So what if we were able to have storage that kicks in when they need that voltage to be at where it needs to be? That can be an option that we provide that person without having to impact our rates at all on this end and provide a solution on it. So that's kind of how we have to go with that. And the equality side of it, it's a little bit hard because in reality, those people benefit from the density of the Cedar Parks and closer here to Austin than they would have if we didn't have that. So there's a little bit of challenge with that. To your earlier questions, we're seeing the benefits of growth just because everyone's moving to this area. And downtown's becoming way more expensive, so everyone's going out of downtown, which is a lot of our territory. And so that's just the reality of what we're seeing. Our CFO came from a co-op in Texas, in Arkansas, and he was telling us about the growth the year before. And he said, I was like, great, 1%. He said, no, one account. And so, the thing with you seeing with utilities, and this is a big question that goes beyond and could get very political, but what does the future of rural America look like? I think is the big question. I know former Secretary Vilsack was really trying to, think about how do we revitalize rural America. Some of it is bringing broadband services into those areas because that causes people not to leave, or if anything, even consider moving to some of those areas. So I think as we see more internet services and other services moving into some of these rural areas, we will see more growth within the co-ops.
Why did you absorb the western area? It seems like it was not in the interest of the people in the eastern area to absorb the western area because it had lower density and therefore would add to expense.
I wish I was here to answer that question for you. I am not sure who ran the economics to see why that was a good idea. Now, it's not uncommon to see co-ops merge, but it's a little bit uncommon to see. I think the history and the thinking was that co-ops could potentially become obsolete, so why don't you just start consolidating all together and become, then you have 180 something IOUs, you end up having 180 something co-ops. So that could have been the thinking of this is what will happen. We haven't seen it, and I do not foresee the consolidations I tend to see is the 6,000 number co-ops joining in together to become a 12,000, for example. But so I wish I was here to, and I will say, I think today's PEC is very different from the PEC of back in that day. I'm sure some of the folks in the room could give a little bit more history than I would, but I think it's a very different way of thinking today.
Thank you again, excellent. You were talking about broadband from fiber maybe being a better opportunity for the underserved. Well, wouldn't that western region be underserved, and is there a chance that by adding those broadband fiber-based solutions and revenue stream to that western region, that could actually balance it out more because that's a better opportunity for the fiber and the broadband, and in essence make it more attractive?
Great question, and the question earlier on we were having a discussion on, there's a trend to see co-ops deploying fiber throughout their territory for specific reasons. One is to support communication on the grid, but that doesn't justify the cost. But then they go into offering services including triple play, cable, phone, internet services. So that's happening on a national scale, and we're seeing more and more co-ops doing this. I think in the last 4 years, there are at least about 15 co-ops who've taken on this venture. When we look at our territory, and our board is interested in looking at this and doing a feasibility study to see how does it pencil out. So there's certain perspectives we have to look at, and when we look at our system, if it's anything underground, if it's single phase, it's about a 4-inch conduit, 3 or 4-inch conduit. If it's a 3-phase, it's 3 4-inch conduits. So when we think of underground, we've got enough room to balloon fiber through without a problem. So we wouldn't have to worry about the space of it going through. So cost becomes more and more realistic. When we look at overhead, our primary is about 6 inches higher than the average utility because we, for whatever reason, have overbuilt our system, much of it for reliability reasons, but that allows us to be able to run fiber on that where only electrically qualified folks can walk on that space, which keeps us relevant if we're going to be in that area. So when you start looking at those dynamics, we're set up in a way where we potentially could use the model of creating the network, essentially building the highway, and then the toll road exists and people just pay toll. Now, the Western Territory, there's good chances that that could potentially make some sense. The Eastern Territory actually possibly could, and in fact could create a sense of competition to the point where it even drives prices lower. So there are opportunities. We possibly will be doing a study soon to look at, and our board has expressed interest in looking at how this would operate. We just from quick back of envelope calculations, there is a possibility of ways we could go about it. But there are many other challenges that you're talking of another complete entity, and quite a few challenges that could come involved in this. And so in some ways it's easier to do it as if you're a smaller co-op than the challenges of a large, 600 million revenue organization.
Thank you, Peter.
Good.
Again, for those of you who want to join us afterwards or go to the Varsity Pizza for a little pizza and beer and continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm looking. Thank you, sir. Fantastic.
Oh, I'm glad
You don't want to be the my internet staff.
yeah, no.